Hi everyone. Let's get started. I think some more people will probably join as we go along, but it's a little after 4:30. Sorry, 5:30. So we'll get started now. Apologies in advance. My dog is going to be making noises in the background. She decided this is a great time to pull out her most aggressively crunchy toy. So apologies in advance. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Just wanted to say first that we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is on the forefront of everybody's minds right now. And we really hope that everybody is home safe with their families, that your families are all healthy as we're getting through this. Of course, even though we have our health concerns, we are also still doing our work here at WildEarth Guardians and Humane Society of the United States. And we've been fortunate enough to be able to figure out how to do these sort of outreach events that we've been doing in person through modern technology like Zoom right now. So just bear with us if there's any technical difficulties, but we are trying to still do this important work, even though these are crazy and unforeseen times. My name is Lindsay Laris. I am the Wildlife Program Director at WildEarth Guardians. I'm also joined here by my colleague, Chris Smith. Chris is Guardian's Southern Rockies wildlife advocate. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. Chris is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we both worked on wildlife killing contest bans in our respective states. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that later. I just want to start by saying that we're two groups here talking about this, but there is a huge coalition of amazing groups and advocates and activists on the ground working on this issue across the country. So I want to give thanks to all of those folks. Just because you don't see them on this video does not mean that we are by far taking all the credit. We're going to talk a little bit more about the giant coalition of folks that make this work possible. And the change that we're seeing across the country right now would not be possible without these other groups. So thank you all from the beginning. Just to give you a little bit of background on Guardians, we are WildEarth Guardians. We have been around for about 30 plus years now, working to preserve and restore wildlife, wild places, rivers, and the health of the American West. We primarily focus on the 11 Western states. So most of this presentation is going to be talking about wildlife killing contests in those states. We're going to touch a little bit on some of the work in other states, but the folks at Humane Society will be happy to answer questions more broadly if folks have those. Guardians, our wildlife work is in many different areas, but it all is sort of encompassed together by this theme that nature and wildlife have this inherent right to exist. And we're trying to work to ensure that policy decisions are made that promote coexistence within our natural world. And wildlife killing contest certainly fits within that purview. So joining us tonight is Aubin Royal. I'm going to kick it over to her to give an intro and to start off our presentation. Thank you. Oh, I just want to say, Chris is going to give a little statement right now, but you can ask questions and we're going to try to do all the questions at the end. Chris, do you want to talk about the chat feature?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Lindsay mentioned, my name is Chris. I'm here in my home state of New Mexico, and I'm going to try to monitor the chat. The chat is the best place to ask questions, especially short or clarifying questions. Please, if you can, select to send your messages to all panelists and attendees rather than just all panelists, which is the default. That just makes it easier so everyone can see. And then, at the end of this webinar, we're going to have a broader discussion. Most of the questions can still come through the chat at that point, but I do want to recognize that there's some real champions and experts of this issue in the webinar. And at that point, if you have something more expansive to say, please use the raise your hand function and I can unmute you and you can say your piece.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aubin Royal. I'm the Colorado State Director for the Humane Society of the United States. My primary job function is really to work on enacting good animal welfare policy within the state of Colorado. I live in Denver. For those of you that are in the area, I live in the Highlands neighborhood in Northwest Denver. We work on a national scale, but again, I focus just here in Colorado, and HSUS is especially interested in the issue of wildlife killing contests. We view these contests as especially egregious and cruel, and of course we share WildEarth Guardians sentiment that wildlife species do have intrinsic value, and so we do what we can to protect those species. We also work on farm animal issues, companion animal issues, and we work internationally as well through our international affiliate, the Humane Society International. We have worked with an awesome coalition of people on this issue throughout the country, and especially in the West. We're so grateful to be a part of that. We're also grateful for you all to being here tonight and taking time. I know it's a little bit stressful right now, and we appreciate you tuning in for a little while to learn about this issue. So let's kick it off. Chris, if you want to hit the next slide. So most of you probably know what wildlife killing contests are, but in case you don't, these are organized contests where participants kill a target species over a 1 or 2 day period for cash or prizes. Contestants pay to enter, and awards are typically given for the most animals killed or the smallest or largest animal. Often an individual winner is responsible for killing dozens of animals just by themselves. So pretty upsetting. We've also seen contests with more creative awards that seem a little bit cruel. In Colorado, for example, one contest gives additional prize money for killing the ugliest prairie dog. Also in Colorado, participants can be awarded for specialty shots, like being able to make a prairie dog explode or causing the prairie dog to flip over when you shoot them. It's pretty awful stuff. Prizes are usually weapons, sometimes semi-automatic rifles, and these prizes are sometimes even given to children who participate. We have also seen contests that advertise specifically to attract children and try to introduce them to hunting this way. We've seen hundreds of participants at these events, but thankfully they're becoming less popular and increasingly low profile as a result of that. It's much more difficult to determine kind of where these contests are happening now. They typically advertise only in their local communities or on sportsman forums online. These contests are extremely unsportsmanlike and cruel, and they serve no greater purpose as a scientifically sound management tool. I know Lindsay will be talking in depth about that in a little bit. And unfortunately, these contests are happening in virtually every state that hasn't outlawed them. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing, and I know you guys can't see it well, but this is just a clip of kind of west and northwestern United States. The map shows the location of killing contests just since 2018 alone. So this just covers the last 2.5 years or so. You can see about 4 in Colorado, Walden, Colorado, in the northwestern part of the state. Pueblo, Keensburg, and San Luis Valley all hosted coyote killing contests during this time period. In many cases, prizes were awarded for the most coyotes killed. This is especially alarming because coyote actually has a prohibition on how many animals you can kill in these contests. It's called a bag limit, and you can only kill 5 individual animals of a certain species per person per day. So given how these contests are advertised, awarding prizes for the most animals killed, this suggests to us that these contests are violating Colorado law. And again, it can be really difficult to know how many contests are really being held in Colorado, but this is what our research has found. So these are the most commonly targeted species, but we've also seen certain states get creative and kill other animals. I just got an alert that my internet connection is unstable. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, sorry about that. I did everything I could to make it happen today. So coyote, red and gray fox. We've also seen swift fox, prairie dogs are very popular here in Colorado as target practice, unfortunately. And then we also sometimes even see bobcats and mountain lions targeted, which is disturbing, raccoons, squirrels, and snakes. Next slide, please. So the Humane Society of the United States does do undercover investigations to look into these contests. Sorry, I didn't give you a warning about the slide. This is a graphic image of animals piled in the back of a pickup truck. There will be no other graphic images during the presentation, just so you know. You can find these investigations online if you Google them. I think we'll also be sending out a link afterward if you're interested. They are disturbing. It is hard to watch, but it really does give you a sense of what these contests are really like, which is why we do these investigations in the first place. These investigations and the undercover footage really demonstrate that this is not hunting at all. This is typically a bunch of people sitting around killing animals for fun, enjoying it, drinking booze, laughing. It's pretty upsetting, and these investigations help us kind of shed a light on the true nature of what's happening. It also helps us get a sense of how many people are participating and how many animals are being killed. Again, sometimes it's hundreds of animals per event, so it gives us a good sense. and whether or not they're increasing or decreasing in popularity. And fortunately, it does look like killing contests are becoming less popular. So these are the reasons given for the contest. None of them are valid. Lindsay will be going into more detail about some of the most popular explanations or reasons. But the good news is overall is most of these reasons really aren't taken seriously by anyone because they're not scientifically sound. So one of them is the protection of livestock. And this also includes eradicating predators and eradicating vermin and pest species from the area. The science isn't there. It doesn't help with that. Another argument is that these contests bring in tourism dollars to rural economies, or that the contests are part of the local culture. However, public perception is shifting, and I think that these rural economies probably need to find different sources of income. Additionally, some sportsmen think that the contests are a good way to recruit new hunters. I grew up going on hunting trips with my father. It involved getting up at 4 a.m., going out in the cold, sitting in a deer blind. It was kind of a sacred, quiet experience. This is sort of the exact opposite of that. So I can't think of a worse way for an individual to be introduced to hunting. These contests are not hunting and do not teach young or new hunters about responsible wildlife management. And I'm going to hand it off to Lindsay now, who's going to go into more detail about some of this.
Great. Thanks, Aubin. So I'm going to go into why should we ban wildlife killing contests? And I think for most of us on the call, that's pretty obvious, but we unfortunately do need to provide this explanation when we go into states and try to get these contests banned through legislation or through regulatory means. So I'm going to go through some of the reasoning that we discuss with these officials. So the first one is that there's not really a good scientific basis that these contests provide valid wildlife management. Especially with coyotes, which is the focus of a lot of killing contests. The rationale for doing them is to say, well, we're getting rid of the population of coyotes that prey on livestock and that could pose a threat to our pets and to humans as well. But as we have seen in the past few months with COVID outbreaks, coyotes are highly adaptive. There's a picture of one of these friends at the Golden Gate Bridge right now, and there's a few of them in San Francisco. And there's been studies that have shown that even if you reduce 70% of a population of coyotes within 1 to 2 years, you'll have that population back. So for the purpose of saying this is a good way to lower populations and to protect our livestock, it's just not valid. The other piece of that is that the contests create sort of chaos in these family structures. Coyotes in particular, again, are the target of many of these contests, and they live in these hierarchical packs. So when you indiscriminately remove members of the pack through these contests, there can be chaos in the pack, especially if the alpha male is killed. So one, you'll have compensatory breeding going on, population still rises, and the pack can be disrupted, leading to actually more conflicts with humans and livestock. So this is contrary to the intent. It's not even just neutral, it actually is negative on the sort of alleged purpose of these contests. Next slide. The other reason that we give for why these contests should be banned is that these sort of contests disrupt ecosystems as a whole. It's not just going out and killing a few animals, which is horrible enough, but it's going out and destroying the system that relies upon those animals in order to exist. Apex predators like coyotes, like mountain lions, bobcats, they provide important rodent control. And if there's too many rodents running around in a system, there's potential for humans to get diseases from those rodents. The other alternative would be to use rat poisons, and then that creates all sorts of other issues. So having that natural rodent control is super important for the ecosystems. Prairie dogs, which these critters right here, they're hugely popular in Colorado as a target for killing contests, unfortunately. They are seen by some as a nuisance for development and other interests like that. So there's contests, some like, as Aubin described for these. So why are prairie dogs important? They're known as what's known as a keystone species. And that means that they're species upon which other species in a system rely upon to exist. What prairie dogs in particular do is that they enhance the diversity of vegetation and vertebrates and invertebrates rely upon that in Colorado. And there's especially important in Colorado for species that are endangered, such as the black-footed ferret, swift fox, burrowing owl. If you take the prairie dog out of the system, you're putting a threat on these already endangered species in the state. So we need to be really careful about what we do when we interrupt nature and what the unintended consequences are going to be of that. Next slide. And this one's one that I think most people on this call can agree with, that these contests are unethical and cruel. Aubin just gave a little hint at some of the really egregious behavior that happens during these contests. And that in itself is horrible. It actually gives hunters a bad name, and I think that's a reason why we're seeing a lot of change. Violates the principle of fair chase and this sort of communing with nature that we see a lot from hunting communities, and gives bad reputation to those who are ethically hunting and doing it for a sustenance purpose. And I just want to say right now that this is not a referendum on hunting. We're not advocating for hunting, but we're just sort of giving these arguments of why there is a difference between killing contests and what we refer to as ethical hunting when it's done, bearing in mind the ecosystem impact as well as what the killing is being done for the purpose of. So in this case, the killing is being done for sport, cash, and prizes. And it's entirely wasteful. It's commercializing something like taking the life of a sentient being, and encourages wanton killing. As those of us who work in animal welfare know, there's a lot of correlation between violence to animals and violence to humans. When we say violence towards a certain animal is okay, we're sort of glorifying violence, and that can have bad unintended consequences on human relationships as well. It's also interesting that a lot of states would actually outlaw the behavior of these killing contests if it were done to a cat or a dog, and it's not when it's being done to an animal that we don't consider as important. So we really are trying to make that connection and saying all of these animals have important value and they should not be, their lives should not be taken in this wanton, wasteful manner. The last piece of this, and this is a swift fox, which just looks like a cartoon character, so adorable, is what's known as the public trust doctrine. And this is kind of a wonky legal thing that we talk about. The government holds certain resources for public benefit as a whole, according to the public trust doctrine. And that would be water, air, and an argument being made for wildlife. Part of what we're seeing in this, you can find more about in some of our other presentations that are available on Guardian's YouTube channel, is that state wildlife agencies are managing wildlife not for the public trust as a whole often, but for the benefit of hunting and agricultural interests. And we're trying to change that because we believe that it should be managed for the public trust. Chris had actually done a great presentation on wildlife management agencies that you can find. When the government allows these sort of contests to happen, it really means that the government is allowing a few people in society to take a public resource. And that violates the public trust doctrine in our view. So we argue that since the majority of people do not support these contests, they should be banned because we should be looking at what the public as a whole is interested in with wildlife. Chris, I believe you are up.
Thanks. So as alluded to earlier, we're seeing momentum, especially at the state level, towards bans on these wildlife killing contests. And there's no kind of geographical focus or limit to those bans. They're spread out. And so far, these are the most comprehensive bans that have passed. We've got California leading the way with an administrative ban in 2014. Vermont passed the first legislative ban in 2018. And then through both methods, Arizona, Massachusetts, and New Mexico passed bans last year. Now, the difference between administrative and legislative bans, for those of you who don't know, a legislative ban is something that is passed into law by a state legislature and signed by the governor. They're typically more durable than an administrative ban, and they're often a little more sweeping than an administrative ban. The caveat I would add there is that New Mexico's legislative ban actually only applies to coyote killing contests and not all wildlife killing contests. So here in New Mexico, at least, folks are continuing to work to ensure that more wildlife is protected from killing contests than just coyotes. We still have other wildlife killing contests, including rattlesnake roundups and rabbit shoots, etc. So how has this begun to happen? Well, there is a shift among the American public in attitudes towards wildlife. I think sportsmen groups are changing their priorities. As Lindsay said earlier, there's a recognition that killing contests are not effective in protecting livestock or increasing ungulate populations. Basically, they're unscientific in terms of being wildlife management. And then we are just doing a better job of organizing and advocating and growing our base of constituents and continuing to build momentum so that people can see it's possible to ban these killing contests across the United States. So I said public attitude towards wildlife is changing, and that's actually concretely true. These numbers come from a 2018 study done by a variety of universities and wildlife management agencies, and they found that in America today, the most common type of attitude towards wildlife is that of a mutualist, and traditionalists are decreasing in terms of their popularity and clout. So a mutualist is someone who primarily believes that wildlife is part of our social network and that we should live in harmony with wildlife, while a traditionalist primarily believes that wildlife should be used and managed for human benefit. And those other two categories that were on the previous slide, a pluralist for our intents here is basically someone who kind of blends these two views, and someone who's distanced from this is someone who essentially doesn't care or doesn't have strong feelings about wildlife. But these are the two, I think, important trends to note in public attitude shift. And the change in the American West is especially prominent. So from 2014 to 2018, Western states averaged a 5.7% decrease in traditionalists, that is, people who primarily view wildlife as something that should be used by humans. And we saw a 4.7% increase in mutualists, that is, someone who sees wildlife as part of our broader network. I know that this is a little hard to read, but these colors here indicate the change in traditionalists, and the lightest colors are those with the biggest change, the biggest decrease in traditionalists. So you see Arizona and California and Nevada especially leading the way in terms of those traditional values decreasing, whereas mutualists are drastically increasing. And Colorado is an outlier here, but even Colorado saw a change in the amount of mutualists in their population. So I mentioned that sportsmen priorities are changing, and this is actually mostly coming from personal experience, having worked with sportsman groups. I don't have a lot of data to back this up, except the one piece of concrete data I have is that hunting participation across the entire US, with very, very few exceptions, is declining. So that means hunters are having to work more to recruit and retain and reactivate new hunters to kind of keep growing their ranks and to keep their ranks stable. So that's become a really, really big priority among sportsman organizations over the last few years. And I think the evidence is there that these killing contests actually do a disservice to the effort to recruit hunters. And this is a quote from the Arizona Game and Fish Commission, which says, "To the extent these contests reflect on the overall hunting community, public outrage with these events has the potential to threaten hunting as a legitimate wildlife management function." So hunters and wildlife agencies are beginning to see these contests as a threat to their efforts to continue to recruit hunters. And then this is the sportsman trend that is a little bit more anecdotal. This is my personal experience, but hunters are more and more having to turn to the existential defense of public lands as a priority for them. So this image comes from a campaign that I actually worked on in Oregon while I was working for a conservation group, and we were working arm in arm with sportsman groups who wanted to keep this forest public. And they knew that in order to work cooperatively with traditional conservation groups, they couldn't be simultaneously promoting things like wildlife killing contests. So I think those are two important trends in the sportsman community. Again, as Lindsay mentioned, there's a big bevy of science that indicates that indiscriminately killing native carnivores is not good for ungulate populations or livestock. And the science has backed that up pretty consistently over the years, but that is more and more permeating into the public and even state wildlife agencies. So this clipping is a little bit old, it's from 2003, but New Mexico was basically indiscriminately killing coyotes, and they decided, you know what, this just isn't working. It's not worth it to keep this up. Finally, I mentioned this big coalition and the momentum around it. These are all the groups listed in the National Coalition to End Wildlife Killing Contests. All these groups play important roles. I want to especially shout out Project Coyote here. There's a number of Project Coyote members on the call. They've been instrumental in leading this effort. And HSUS is another co-chair of this coalition. But we're seeing more and more groups get involved in these efforts, and that just enables us to build more power and push these legislative and administrative bans. So I was involved kind of in the end of the effort here in New Mexico to pass legislation to ban killing contests of coyotes. And I know that this is kind of a funny picture, but it illuminates this long campaign and kind of the exhausting nature of it. This picture I took around 1:30 a.m. From the stands of the legislature as the final House vote occurred to pass this bill. And it was a really long, exhausting campaign, and I was only there for the end of it. Other groups like Project Coyote, Animal Protection Voters, the Sierra Club, Southwest Environmental Center, they were involved from the get-go. But this took a long time, and it took a lot of work. It took a broad coalition, and it took kind of isolating the issue a little bit. So Meredith asked earlier about messaging and what's effective to legislators. I think New Mexico especially illustrated that we made this specifically about stopping the wanton killing of coyotes. You can still protect your livestock, you can still hunt, but this is about wanton killing. And I think that was really effective here in New Mexico. And then finally, I alluded to the broader shift in sportsman groups. That played out here in New Mexico really acutely. When this bill was first introduced, the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, which is kind of the biggest sportsman group here in the state, was opposed to the bill. And by the time we passed the bill in 2019, they were a supporter of the bill. So again, a lot of work, but these shifting paradigms underneath us are helping us to do that work better. And I'd like to turn it back to Aben, who's working in Colorado with Lindsay on, y'all are just a little bit behind New Mexico. It's okay, don't be ashamed, but they're working on a killing contest ban in Colorado currently.
You can go to the next slide, Chris. So as I mentioned earlier, in Colorado, we do have a bag limit of 5 animals of a specific species per day per individual. So theoretically, this should kind of do away with contests as they typically award prizes for most animals killed in a span of time. However, Coloradans have been creative and have found other awards and prizes to give out, so the contests are still happening. Additionally, as I mentioned, we do think that some contests are still awarding prizes for most animals killed in violation of state law. So we're trying to close this bag limit loophole. It literally involves striking that one sentence from Colorado regulation, which would thereby eliminate contests altogether. So as part of a coalition of groups, we've submitted a citizen petition to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. This is the state wildlife agency here in Colorado. This would ban all contests for small game and fur bearers, and it will be formally heard on April 30th, so it's coming up. It's obviously going to be a virtual hearing, and I'll be presenting on the petition along with Johanna Hamburger from Animal Welfare Institute. We're super excited about the opportunity, and hopefully we'll be given a favorable ruling that day, and then we'll be moving forward to the rulemaking process. So there would be a vote on the 30th, and then at the next commission meeting, there would be another public hearing and vote to approve the final rulemaking. So April 30th is not the last step, but we're almost there. We are cautiously optimistic that Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission will be banning contests, these contests. We have heard from agency staff and members on the commission that want this to happen, and we're very excited about that. We think that it's time for it to happen here in Colorado. We've also found that some of the most convincing arguments for our state have not even really been focused on these arguments that, you know, this addresses pests or predators to protect livestock. It seems to us that the commission isn't even entertaining those and knows that there's no scientific value behind those arguments. Here, again, just the waste of wildlife and how it kind of goes against what hunters believe to be ethical hunting has been sort of the best argument here. And we have heard that there are hunters groups that are also advocating the same position as us. They're just not doing it super vocally or publicly, but it is happening, and that's also really encouraging and exciting. So we really need to get the word out. The way we're sort of reaching out to the commission in a channeled, controlled way for this petition is that WildEarth Guardians has created a Colorado-specific petition. So we're going to share this in the chat and send it around to all the participants who registered. And sharing and signing on to that would be super, super helpful. So if you want a way to get involved here in Colorado, also feel free to submit letters to the editor in your local paper. It's really great to raise awareness about this issue just generally. I don't think people really realize it's happening, and certainly not in Colorado. So raising awareness around this issue is key.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, and just to add to that, I know not everybody on this call is in Colorado. We really only need people who are based in Colorado for the petition. Don't worry, we have another one if you're not in Colorado, but the commissioners want to hear from residents. And part of this that, you know, Chris talked about that the states that have banned these contests, but the interesting thing is if you look at this map, California was the first one in 2014, and these other states started in 2018 and then 2019. So there's really momentum building. And an argument that's also been persuasive in Colorado is that Arizona and New Mexico have done it. And we don't really want to be the last state to do it in our little southwest corner. So that that sort of competition element helps. And I imagine in the Northeast, maybe that could be a useful argument as well. States that have currently been taking action. So this has been a strange legislative session in light of COVID, and also even with the regulatory agencies because of meetings needing to be canceled or figured out other ways. But this year there was legislation, and there is still pending legislation in New Hampshire, New York, and New Jersey. Those states are technically all still in session. It's unclear how those sessions are going to resolve for the rest of the year, but there are bills in those states. Oregon has had a bill for the past few years, including most recently in the session that just ended in March 2020. And the reason that it hasn't moved forward in Oregon isn't really about the bill, but more with sort of the dynamics, political dynamics at play in Oregon. And if there's folks on the call from Oregon, we can talk about that a little bit during questions. Maryland is also considering a ban. I'm not sure if they're still in session right now. Regulatory, we talked about Colorado. Washington State has also discussed in February 2020, right before COVID outbreak, having the commission look to drafting a rule to ban these contests. So it's sort of interesting to see how we've gone from one state to sort of a bunch of states in one clump getting together. And that just goes to show sort of the public sentiment. And once you kind of get the momentum going, you can see that more and more pickup is there. And we hope to see this whole map filled out eventually. Next slide. So we really like to have people be able to do something and not just see this and be like, well, that's terrible. Okay, now what? So Chris is going to send out some links. And as we said, we're also going to send them around to everybody who's registered. WildEarth Guardians has a petition for a federal ban. The hope is to collect enough names on this petition that for our next administration that might be a little bit more friendlier, we can show there's a lot of public will towards this, and let's get a federal agency like BLM to ban these contests from ever happening on federal public lands. They have no place on our federal public lands. HSUS has a great toolkit on wildlife killing contests. So if your state is not one of those states that has a ban already, there's great materials in there on who to contact, letters to the editor, samples, talking points, things like that. And you can also reach out to Alban. I'm sure she'd be happy to connect you with an HSUS state director in your state. Likely they're working on it there. In Colorado, we mentioned the Guardian specific Colorado petition. We're going to gather names. We're going to present the petition with the number of signatures that we have to the commission next week. We don't want to flood the commissioners' inboxes with these messages. They're very aware, they're very supportive. So that's why we're kind of doing it in this way, to just say, here's the people from the state that are also supporting without overwhelming the commission when they have a lot of issues they're dealing with, especially during this time. So that is, next slide. So that is the end of our presentation. Here's our contact information for the three of us. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, or if you don't feel like asking a question right now. We're going to open this up to questions in 1 minute, just to let everybody know this is being recorded. So we are having all the videos of our webinars that WildEarth Guardians has been doing the past 2 months on our YouTube channel. There's a lot of them. So if you really want to dig into wildlife issues or other environmental issues, you can find all the videos there. You can share this with your friends, family. It'd be really great. We love the support. So now, thanks, Aubin and Chris, and we can open it up to questions. I'm sure it looks like the chat box is just like going off right now. So yes, and if you're somebody else on the call who has expertise, which I'm sure most of you are, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, and we'll unmute you, because I know there's a lot of experts on here as well.
I think we're preaching to the choir a little bit tonight. I see a lot of animal advocates in here. And Jill, thank you. Jill Fritz from the Humane Society of the United States is sort of our issue expert for this campaign. And I see she's been active in the chat answering questions. So thank you so much, Jill.
There's a question that was asked earlier that I think is a really interesting one. And again, I would encourage folks to raise your hand and I can unmute you if you have an answer to this. But Meredith asks, have there been studies into the best messaging practice around this issue? And Maryland legislators seemed more interested in the wanton waste of these contests than an animal welfare prospect. But has the effectiveness of messages been measured?
I mean, I can give a guess. That's going to be a real guess. As far as I'm aware, there's no sort of measurement taken. And I also think that it varies by states. And, you know, our culture is very different in Colorado than maybe somewhere else. I moved out here from California and everybody was telling me, this isn't California. So I realized the messaging had to be tweaked for what, you know, what flies here in our Fish and Game Commission. And I'm sure Chris found that in New Mexico. It might be different than Oregon. So I think it's pretty state specific. I do think that the environmental sort of ecosystem argument, they've heard, they get, it's important to bring up. But it really is that this practice is just like really egregious and really just offends people morally. And I think that's coming out more and more. And that's what I've sort of seen as a more persuasive message. I don't know if Aubin or Chris, you want to weigh in?
I think you're right that each state is different, and even each, you know, for example, in the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, we have all sorts of commissioners, and some of them are better than others. The main argument that I think we hear, or not argument, but the thing that gets brought up, it's in the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission specifically, is definitely the waste of animals and of a public resource. And then, you know, we did have one commissioner bring up the idea that this helps recruit young hunters. And so we were able to address that with her directly by meeting with her and also by talking about that in our testimony as well. Unfortunately, we had the support of hunters that also agreed that this is not the best way to expose young people to hunting.
Yeah, again, in New Mexico, watching the legislative floor debates especially, which are where a lot of the arguments really come to a head because you're balancing on the point of a pin, trying to get your bill passed. I really think it was about how unnecessary and cruel and wasteful the contests were. You know, it wasn't about how amazing coyotes are or how, you know, we shouldn't be killing wildlife at all. It was really, really focused. But again, as Lindsay said, I think it probably depends on your locale and kind of the values in that area. And the politics too. Kevin Bixby, who helped with the New Mexico state ban, asks, do the pending state bans ban all wildlife killing contests or just coyotes?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I was getting distracted by the comments.
The bans that are currently pending, both administrative and legislative, do those cover all wildlife or just coyotes?
In Colorado, it's small fur bearers, which includes prairie dogs as well as coyotes. It does not include fish or birds here. I think it probably varies by state. In Arizona, the one that passed, I think, was more for coyotes specifically, as well as New Mexico. I don't know about the other states. Jill, do you want to weigh in on that, since you're the all over expert?
Jill just weighed in the comments. She said the pending state bans cover fur bears and predator species, except for Oregon, which is just coyotes.
Right. I was going to say, yeah, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and New Hampshire are in Washington State, which is also due to be introduced soon, are all predator and fur bear species. But yes, Oregon is just coyotes. Correct.
So here's sorry, did we answer that question fully?
Yes.
Okay, to the best of our ability. Here's a question from Casey York, who says that the list of supportive organizations is impressive. However, we had very little help in Montana in 2019 with Senator Phillips's bill. Any thoughts and or future efforts, as in how can other groups help in some of these states where there hasn't been a bigger coalition?
We happen to have an office of WildEarth Guardians in Montana, and we're happy to, if you want to email me or Chris, we can put you in touch with our conservation director, Sarah McMillan, who's based there. And she might have some ideas as a long-term environmental lawyer, as well as a Montanan, is that the correct term, who's lived there for a long time. So that would be great if you could talk to her about that. I'm sure she would love to help.
We also have a state director in Montana who should be, if she wasn't involved in this effort already, should be.
Great. And then this isn't a question, but from Don Molde, who he has a 5-year study in Nevada on compensatory breeding of coyotes as a result of wildlife services killing animals. And he recommends you email him if you'd like a copy of that. Here's a question from Donald Hilligoss. Is there any source I can go to in order to find out if there are any wildlife killing contests in my state? And he's in Connecticut.
HSUS has been the best source of information for where these are happening.
Yeah, so I don't have that information right in front of me, but I do have a GIS link. It looks like Jill says we don't have any in Connecticut, but we do have we have mapped out where we have found the contests. It doesn't mean there aren't any happening. It just means we weren't able to find them. We do have a map and we can see, where they are occurring. So if anyone else isn't sure if they're happening in their state, feel free to email me and I can check our list and see if there are any active contests.
And I would just add to that, just because there's not any happening right now in Connecticut, I still think it's worthwhile to do bans in those states. It doesn't mean they can never happen in the future. So I think that's an important concept that not a lot of people, they just think, if it's not a problem right now, let me just not worry about it. It's good to take care of the problem. And it also sends a message to your legislators that this is an important issue, and animal welfare generally is an important issue.
So this is not pertaining, it's not a question, nor is it pertaining to killing contests in particular, but I think it's important. Deborah says that Colorado Parks and Wildlife site has an open comment section regarding increased mountain lion killing, and you can go there to comment. Mountain lions are not hunted for food or subsistence. It's simply recreational killing, much like killing contests. So thank you, Deborah. I think that's important to do.
Yes, so Robin and I have been involved in that effort, and HSUS is putting together an organizational comment letter. But yes, we would love more public comments from those folks in Colorado. So thank you for raising that.
And I have a talking points document and a fact sheet if you are interested in learning more. Probably 50% of my job is working on reducing trophy hunting of mountain lions. So feel free to contact me.
And right now we are out of questions. So again, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand, or I guess if you have any other thought. But I think I've read them all out.
Don't be shy. Ask us your questions. Or if there's anybody on the call that wants to talk about anything that their group is doing. Oh, okay. Chris, do you want to read that question?
Sure. Taylor Adamski, who has worked on wildlife issues here in New Mexico with WildEarth Guardians, asks, could you elaborate on the political dynamics that have been a barrier in passing a ban in Oregon?
So, I don't know who else, if Kelly Peterson's on, but Samantha Ruger from WildEarth Guardians is on, as is Jennifer Haig from ALDF, and they're both based in Oregon, so perhaps they want to unmute and talk a little bit about it. Samantha.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What happened in Oregon is that it's odd here in that they need a quorum to pass laws in the legislature. So for the past 2 sessions, the Republicans have walked out, and it's made it difficult for anything to go through. And so that's pretty much what's killed the bill each time, was that Republicans walk out. And it's our belief, myself and many other groups, that if Kelly Peterson's on here, she was really the lead on this. It's our belief that it was traded maybe last session in as a way to get the Republicans back to the table. And then this year, the Republicans did not come back at all. So that's kind of the politics behind the legislature here. The other issue is that coyotes and beaver are both considered predatory animals in Oregon. And predatory animals are only regulated by the legislature and not by the State Wildlife Commission. So we have to go through the legislature to accomplish any amendments towards their management.
Yeah. And just to be clear, they did not walk out over the coyote bill specifically. They walked out over a climate bill. It just impacted the coyote bill. So yeah. I believe there's discussion about how to sort of address that in 2021 to make sure that this bill passes next session.
Yeah, and I would just add, as someone who worked in the Oregon legislature a little bit in my past, you want to read some zany political stuff, read about what goes on in the Oregon legislature over the last couple of years.
Now I'm very, very curious.
Here's a question from Don again. Can WildEarth Guardians and Humane Society provide a list of members in a particular state or send out an alert to members within a state? Yes, we can send out an alert to members within a state, Don, and we can help to move people, at least WildEarth Guardians. I will let Aubin answer for HSUS.
The question is just generally, can we send out, can we we absolutely can and do regularly activate our supporters in the state of Colorado and our members, past donors, to take action on certain items. We can't alert them over everything, but when something is a priority issue for us, or there's an issue kind of coming to a head, we use that resource quite a bit.
And I think HSUS can, you're the state director for Colorado, but I think HSUS and other states can do that as well, just, right?
That's right. We don't share our list of members, which I think is industry standard.
Yeah, we don't share our list either, but yes, definitely we are able to send out blasts, and we do that a lot, especially during legislative sessions or when there's issues. But we also appreciate people bringing those issues to our attention, because we are not physically based in every state. So it's important to that activists let us know sort of what's going on if we're not there.
Joe asks if WildEarth Guardians has members in Ohio. Joe, we likely do, but we don't work in Ohio. That sounds a little funny, but our work is focused in the West, and we likely have members supporting our work in the West who live in Ohio. I don't know if that's helpful to you, hopefully. And then Kevin Bixby asks, do you think the killing contest issue provide an opportunity for wildlife advocates to talk about the need for systemic change in state wildlife management?
Yes, I definitely do believe that that's the case, because I think that this, to me, seems like a low-hanging fruit issue. This is something that's becoming more and more disfavored. It's a horrible practice. And the reason that it's still allowed in part is because hunting interests dominate the way that rules are made in the Parks and Wildlife or Fish and Game commissions across the country, especially in the West. So by sort of pointing to this and saying, but this is not what people want, especially people who are not hunters, but also hunters also don't want this, it kind of moves the needle. And it's a good conversation starter to sort of talk about, you know, there shouldn't be wanton waste of wildlife. And go ahead, Chris, sounds like you want to add something.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's interesting that you asked it, Kevin. because I think, you know, the coyote issue in New Mexico, and Kevin knows all this, but I think it's an important question. The coyote issue in New Mexico had to go through the legislature rather than the game commission, in part because we had a really bad game commission, but also because coyotes aren't regulated at all in New Mexico. They live entirely outside of the law. And so this was actually a prohibition on contests that didn't actually touch on coyote management at large. And so I think, as we discuss in other places, the management of wildlife that is otherwise kind of outside of the realm of hunters and anglers and ag interests, we have an opportunity to talk about all wildlife and how all wildlife serves public values, both in terms of ecosystem management, but also, you know, economically, aesthetically, et cetera. So I think it provides that angle as well.
I'll also chime in real quick. Both of your answers are great. I completely agree with you. And I also just wanted to say that, you know, here in Colorado, as in other Western states, we were having a lot of really serious discussions about systemic problems within the Wildlife Agency and what we can do to improve that, potentially through legislation, changing the required makeup of commission members, which currently requires sportsmen, people in oil and gas. Well, one of the potential lists of people that can be included is representatives with oil and gas. There's required members from ag, and we just don't think that some of these people belong on a Parks and Wildlife Commission. We would love to see, you know, maybe a requirement for a biologist, scientist, whatever it is, non-consumptive users. And so we are having these discussions, and, you know, another opportunity I think is the finance piece of that. And that's that many of these wildlife agencies are struggling with funding. And, you know, non-consumptive users, people that don't hunt or fish, but just hike or photograph wildlife, how can they throw money in the pot? How can they help fund the agency? Right now, you know, obviously getting their funding from sportsmen and people that fish, it sort of all makes sense. We just need to find more creative ways for non-consumptive users to contribute. So buy your park passes and do whatever you can to, you know, have a voice for the agency.
And here in Colorado, if you buy lottery tickets, you can support wildlife, which is really interesting, and I learned about recently. But there are, you know, it varies a lot by state. There's weird state laws in Colorado that sort of make the funding issue difficult, that we're not going to get into right now. But I think, you know, it's very state specific, the makeup of the commission and also the funding mechanisms. But that's a Chris webinar that's already up on our site, I believe. I think Chris and Kevin a little bit. Are there any other questions that we have?
Yeah, I've kind of lost track. It looks like there's been some chatter about Ohio, and I think that has mostly been answered. And apologies if I'm missing something, but there was another question. Was the petition process in Colorado, did the petition start the process in Colorado is basically the question.
So I'm happy to touch on that. So we introduced the petition in November or December, so a while ago. We found out very recently that simultaneously there were other sources bringing this issue to the commission and to the governor's office. So I think it was like a perfect storm. I don't think our citizen petition is leading the way, but we do happen to still have it active. But there are other sources bringing this to the table and starting this conversation right now. So of course, we're not going to withdraw our petition because of that. We hope that they will take action on it, but either way, it seems like the agency is going in the right direction with this and intends to do away with the contest. So we're really happy. No matter how it gets there, we're happy that it does.
Rachel asks, why stop at banning wildlife killing contests? Why not a ban on all coyote hunting? They're a keystone species, aren't they? So my personal take and WildEarth Guardians' position is mostly in line with this, is that we shouldn't be killing animals that don't provide any food or any value in terms of killing them. And especially, you know, native carnivores are self-managing. Their populations are dependent on habitat and prey. So they're not going to explode unless you actually go in and mess with them, like in a wildlife killing contest. So I actually agree that there should not be hunting of animals, especially carnivores, especially if you're not going to eat them. I don't know if Avin and Lindsay want to weigh in on that again.
So yeah, I mean, I think that, why don't we go there politically, or why is that not what we're seeking out now, is it's a good question. Unfortunately, coyotes are still so vilified, especially coyotes and wolves are very vilified as, being these evil predators that, kill people's livestock and are dangerous and all of this stuff. So there's a lot of education about doing more non-lethal management to avoid the human wildlife interest, and that's a lot of the work that Guardians focuses on. Project Coyote obviously does a lot of that as well. So we're trying to move the needle. This would be sort of the first step into recognizing that killing species that hasn't actually posed a direct threat to human health, which is really the only time that we think that there is a justified reason to kill these predators. If you're being attacked, if there's an imminent threat, that this doesn't work and it has no place. So that's kind of why killing contests are a little bit of this entry point into saying, like, okay, well, if that's bad, let's look at other things. But we're just not there yet, unfortunately. Even in California, even in some of the most progressive states, there's not a ban on killing coyotes, unfortunately.
Yeah, I echo much of what they said. The HSUS is primarily focused on the most egregious and inhumane forms of hunting. We view that to be, trophy hunting, body gripping traps. We don't like cage traps. Baiting animals, for example. So that's sort of what we're focused on right now, but we do promote non-lethal management, as Lindsay said. And we even have a program where we train wildlife officials and law enforcement on how to successfully sort of deal with issues with coyotes, for example, in areas where there are a lot of people, which people are spooked when they see a coyote in the city and they don't realize that coyote always lives there year round. And he's always there, they just usually don't see him. So we have a program specifically to sort of raise awareness and talk to law enforcement about how to manage that in a non-lethal way.
So it is 6:30. I want to be cognizant of people's time. There's a really interesting question here that I do not have a good answer to, but I think we should touch on it. Is there any effort to look into the connection between gun manufacturers and using contests as a marketing opportunity? This is from Laura. Laura, I do not know if there's an effort, but I suspect there are connections. I'll turn it over to others who might have more info.
I'm not aware that that's something that we've looked into, but it is very interesting. And I saw some other chats earlier too about companies that are, semi-automatic weapon rifle companies that sponsor these contests. It's incredibly disturbing. I'm not sure it's something that we've focused on specifically, but it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I think that's I gave a webinar a few weeks ago about basically funding at state level for wildlife management. And I touched on that a little bit because I think there's a shift from hunters largely funding state level wildlife management and conservation. And as hunters are declining, to some extent, gun rights advocates are starting to fill that void a little bit, which is going to create some disturbing policy trends. So you are welcome to go watch that, although I didn't get too deep into that. Rachel asks if WildEarth Guardians or HSUS has a good example of non-lethal management success. And the reason I wanted to read this is because Rachel, yes, is the short answer, but on May 11th, WildEarth Guardians is going to be hosting a webinar with someone who works on the ground doing livestock wildlife coexistence. So not a nonprofit, not a state agency, someone who actually does this on the ground. And I would encourage you to attend that. If you can't, just shoot me an email and I can provide you some resources.
Yeah. And I think we should try to wrap it up, even though there's still, I love seeing all the chatter. I can't even keep up with it. I like people connecting and asking questions. So this has been great. Do feel free to contact us. We're going to send an email around with the links because they might have gotten lost in the chat.
Oh yeah.
It's okay. I can send that around to the email list. And, please, if you're in Colorado, share the petition. The hearing's it's a week from today. So that one's really pressing, the federal petition as well. And then the HSUS toolkit that will provide a lot of useful tools if you're looking to get momentum going in your own state. So thank you, everybody, and thanks, Aubin and Chris, and thanks, Chris, for handling the comments and moderating as well as speaking.
And I just want to thank one more time all the individuals and groups that are not represented here, but are leading and working on this issue too.
Great.
Thank you all for having me, and thanks for joining, guys. And for those of you that are, doing advocacy work during this time, we're super grateful for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.